Thank you everyone for joining in. I'll just get my timer started. And we're here to discuss integrity in action, a panel discussion on the ethical challenges and solutions in publishing. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Before we begin, there's a quick disclaimer. All content used in this presentation is owned or licensed by Crimson Interactive, and some content may have been blocked for confidentiality reasons, but unauthorized use of any part of this presentation is prohibited. Although it is free to share, please, always give licensing attributes to Crimson Interactive before you use the presentation. And that brings me to the next slide, which is the best one. I have with me two esteemed panelists. We have Daniel Ugo, who's the head of ethics and research integrity at American Physical Society. Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we have Leslie McIntosh, who's the VP Research Integrity at Digital Science. Thank you so much, Leslie. Hello.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you so much. And I am Dr. Anupama Kapadia. I am the editor-in-chief at Inago Academy, and I'll be moderating this event. Thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us. And before we begin with the webinar, we'd like to just inform you of the free access to different resources and materials that we have for you. So basically, you are free to post your questions on our LinkedIn Live events. We have this also live on YouTube, as well as the chat section here. We will also be providing you with free resources to download and refer to after the webinar. And after this, you will also receive a recording link where you will watch the webinar again for free. As mentioned on your screen, please post your questions using either the chat section or the Q&A section. We will try to answer as many as possible. And we're on to the next slide where this is the agenda for today. We're basically going to discuss the trends and challenges in publication ethics, followed by common causes of misconduct and identifying them. Then we'll quickly delve into the role, potential, and future directions of using technology in upholding ethics. And finally, the institutional responsibilities and collaborative efforts with publishers to strengthen integrity overall. And finally, we do have the Q&A session at the end, but feel free to, like I mentioned, feel free to post your questions in the middle of the session also. With that, let's begin the background. Let's begin discussing the background. And the image in front of you should actually shock you because look at the trend ever since 2017 to 2023. The challenges in publication ethics have increased manifold. In 2017, we had very basic issues like data image integrity concerns, missing attributions, plagiarism, authorship. And several publishers and institutions had started taking stock of how to repair them and how to fix them. But then we were again faced with a lot of issues related to paper mills in the year 2020 and recycled images and data, fake original data, duplicate and simultaneous submissions, again related to paper mills. And then finally in 21, the wave of technology just took over. There were early signs of AI usage when ChatGPT came into the question and other generative AI tools. There were tortured and nonsense phrases that were submitted to journals, accepted and published, and then had to be retracted. Finally, there is a use of LLMs, again like ChatGPT, recycled peer review reports, compromised fake stakeholders, special issue cartels, etc. Overall, it has led to a compromised, integrity. The picture is compromised overall from a science point of view because the gatekeeping just doesn't seem to be enough, and which is why we're actually having this event so that we are able to also educate our audience on what is exactly happening and what is planned for the future. So quickly moving to panelists' insights on what we just saw. Why are certain areas like undeclared competing interests, compromised stakeholders, and special issue integrity increasingly vulnerable? And what are the safeguards that can be introduced to protect against these issues? Daniel, would you like to go first?
Happily, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to address these very important issues. So I think that the most important thing about running a peer review process and about publication is to make sure we know who we're working with. I work at the American Physical Society for the journals that we publish to deal with publication ethics issues, and we have a shared referee database that is used by all the journals, and we only communicate with reviewers through that. We don't allow, for instance, editors to email reviewers independently. And when we use guest editors, which is not frequent for us, they have to follow our standard editorial procedures and work very closely with the staff editor body to guide them.
All right, so that sounds interesting because I think offline emails are also not just from a safeguard point of view, can protect integrity, but also I think it prevents predatory journals and predatory publishers to get in touch with authors. So if authors and researchers just come to know, or they're aware that legitimate publishers do not use emails, I think half of our problems might just get curtailed there. Leslie, what do you think?
Yeah.
What's your point of view?
I think that I want to bring this out a little bit to think about why do we have this problem. And I think we have this problem because two things simultaneously happened. The movement towards open science and moving research to open, or at least the outputs of research to be more transparent, simultaneously with the rapidly advancing technological developments. And what happened though in the scientific ecosystem is that we didn't also open and think about the trust that we have, that we may check behind the scenes for what is legitimate research, what are and vetting of both the research and the researchers. And that has not grown at the same pace. It has not been as transparent, and that needs to be addressed. So specifically to the question of why is it increasingly vulnerable, because you have a lot more people looking at the science as well, and people can dig into things, and some of the nuances of and the complexities within scientific communities are not as transparent anymore.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And also, I think we'll come to the next slide on this, but I guess because of the increasing awareness now and increasing transparency, we are getting some retrospective action by publishers, which include primarily retractions, right? So I think that kind of explains it, but we'll come to that on the next slide. But on to the next question. With the increasing involvement of coordinated groups in data manipulation, peer review hacking, and authorship buying, because now they seem to be more coordinated and more expert at this, how can publishers and institutions work together to combat these organized threats effectively? Because, say one is the source, and if I could call publishers the target, right? There has to be some bridging between the two. So Daniel, what's your take on this?
Yes, well, I think thematically very similar to what I said earlier. And then there's been a lot of interesting work done with trust markers like ORCIDs, for instance, and other such things. We are having more and more cross-publisher collaboration. And if we are basically can agree on the sort of signals that indicate that we're dealing with a legitimate entity rather than say a paper mill, then we can collectively use practices to, as you say, combat these organized threats effectively. But we do have to work collectively on this, and here again, collaboration is key.
Definitely. Let's also take Leslie's take on this. Leslie, what do you think?
First of all, I agree with Daniel about collaboration. That's absolutely key on this. Two things that have to simultaneously occur. And one is to go through and do a course correction of everything in the literature, at least for the past, I would say from 2016 is when we really started. You have 2017, I think we look at data, maybe 2016 as a baseline, and then it moves up from then, but we really need to look at the literature and clean it where we can. The other thing that needs to happen, so that's prevention. We also need, obviously, working together to see what is going out, whether it or coming in, going out of institutions, coming into publishing. We need to have that, and then consistent monitoring of, and we have to think that there will always be something else. right? Paper mills and AI may be very popular right now, but there will always be an interest in influencing the scientific ecosystem, regardless if it is or because of individual motivations or organizational motivations or even geopolitical motivations.
For sure. We have a question from one of the attendees. I think it's relevant to this slide. So the question is, can you give some examples of post-publication collaboration? Would either of you like to take a dig at this?
I can take this as a start.
Yes.
Not necessarily. Well, I think this gets into some of the things that we're going to talk about later. So just thank you for that question. I can tell you, I'm one that goes in and understands some of the manipulation that goes on and the coordinated manipulation that goes on within science. And ideally, what happens is we let the publisher know, and we also let an institution know. And a very good example of this is that in 2022, and you can look this up, it ended up being the most popular retraction watch story. I found a nefarious network that was going on, an authorship for sale network that was going on.
Oh.
And with my organization, I work at Digital Science, and with them, we contacted the institution and the research integrity officers, and they were able to basically address this person who did admit he was a graduate student, so this is public knowledge, and he admitted to having plagiarized 70% of the papers, and they started working with the publishers in order to get another one retracted. The other very important part of this is that once you are in, it's not just these coordinated groups doing one-time things, it's a network. And when people get in that network, it's hard to get out of as well. And in this case, it was really nice to see some other institutions working with their either young researchers or grad students to help get them out of the network. So maybe they bought a paper and they shouldn't have, not saying, I'm not saying that's right, but to help get them out, get that paper retracted and back on the right track. So that took a coordination of both our company, the institution, and the publishers in order to make that happen.
Thanks for that. Moving on to the next slide, because we are talking about retractions, and strangely, Leslie mentioned we should look at data from prior to 2017. So here we have data from 2013. As we can see on our screen, the number of retractions is growing year on year. 2023 obviously was a bumper year. It was also an off year because primarily the retractions belong to Hindawi, right? But you can still see the trend, even if you remove the 8,000 retractions by Hindawi, still 21 to 23, it is still around 2,000 to 2,500 retractions across journals, across publishers, which is a high number. And again, I don't think the cleanup has happened so far. What Leslie mentioned, what Daniel mentioned, the cleanup hasn't happened. So potentially there are more papers that could get retracted if the cleanup actually happens. And the discipline that seems to be suffering in this, when we move to the next slide, is what we can see is the biomedicine discipline. So this slide actually tells you the impact and the gravity of the frequency of retractions across disciplines in the field of biomedicine. So this data, we've directly taken it from the NIH website, and it is absolutely credible. But as you can see, the frequency of retractions across these disciplines is alarming. And imagine the subject areas or the therapeutic areas that suffer the most are actually oncology and cardiology. I mean, those are life-threatening diseases where now we can almost be sure that the research that is out there is actually not reliable enough. And how dangerous is that for patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders in the healthcare industry? So this is actually a concern. And not too far behind, but we don't have enough data. The next slide actually gives the impact for the fields of basically other fields other than biomedicine. So we found a few news articles and a few press releases where the number of papers getting retracted, even in the fields of chemistry, material science, chemical engineering, physics, electromagnetics, right? It is all coming out. And although it started with life sciences and health sciences, it is slowly and steadily moving into the other disciplines. So this kind of gets me to the next question. What are some of the key factors that are driving retractions, and how are they evolving? How are journals countering them also? Because it's not a good thing for journals to have retractions. I mean, there is a lot of cost, effort, the brand impact, right? Of course, they don't want it, but they have to do it. So what are these key factors? Daniel, if you'd like to take a hit at this first.
Yeah, sure. I actually have to disagree with you right off the bat about retractions not being a good thing, because
Okay.
the alternative is that problematic research continues to sit there and basically pollute the scientific literature. So
Absolutely.
I was just recently at an event about research, a conference about research integrity, containing stakeholders of publishing institutions and funders. And there was a sort of somewhat offhand discussion about what's the ideal level of retractions. And I can't tell you what the ideal number of retractions is, but I know which number is absolutely not ideal, and that is 0. There will always be even good faith errors in scientific in academic
Yes.
publication that need to be corrected.
Yes.
So 0 is not 0. We should not be shooting for 0 retractions.
I
As
agree with
for
you.
your actual question, I think that we do live in a different world now. We look back a little bit in the history on many of your slides. And if you compare to, say, 20 years ago, we didn't have pub here, we didn't have social media, we didn't have all these sleuths. Things are more accessible, and which is a good thing. And as a consequence, there are more people looking at things and finding things and comparing things. Previously, it would be very difficult to spot, for instance, self-plagiarism or salami slicing tactics, because it wouldn't be as obvious. You could hide it in a number of journals that you wouldn't necessarily have access to. It's not that that 20 years ago there were many journals that were just not available online, and we have more the incentives from 20 years ago have not gotten less perverse and less toxic, and if anything, it's become worse. But more is also happening because we're noticing more plagiarism detection software, integrity software for images have gotten more sophisticated. And so I think that we're looking harder and we're seeing more, but also we do have some new developments, like the problems of paper mills, like the problems of these networks, authorship for sale. And so there are a number of factors that are, it's hard to narrow down to one specific thing.
Definitely.
Yeah. Do you want me
sorry.
to answer question 2 as well right
Yes,
now?
that's for you as well. Yes, sure.
Yes. So I think that one thing that I am noticing looking at retractions and whenever I'm talking to my colleagues or publishers that publish more in life sciences is that we're not seeing as many image integrity problems. I like to think that our plots are more statistical, more quantitative, more line graphs, for instance. But I don't want to rest on my laurels here, because we also do publish a lot of, for instance, scanning microscopy, electron microscopy, tunneling microscopy, a number of such images that are more open to interpretation. And there's a sleuth out there called Reese Richardson who has started paying attention to these in the physical sciences and the material science, and he's come up with some patterns of irregularities. So the physical sciences are absolutely not immune from image irregularities. And let's us not forget that you can write whatever numbers you want in a spreadsheet and plot a line graph, and you can just make things up. And it's very hard to find out how that's wrong unless you really dig into the underlying data.
All right. Thanks for that, Daniel. We have a question from an attendee. So the attendee asks, what are the panelists' take on the role of social media and public engagement to improve filtering erroneous data via retractions? Leslie, I think have you to answer this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to answer that. I want to add one thing to the first one, and that is Retraction Watch, that came into being 10 years ago and made retractions more transparent and the discussions of it. So I think that has affected the first one. So the first question, sorry. Thank you for the question, Catherine. On the take on social media and public engagement, I have mixed feelings on this, to be very honest. On the one hand, I am part of the community. I mean, I speak with sleuths. I work on kind of a different level. I look at network analysis and trust markers and other types of nefarious, both good and nefarious things that happen in science. And one of the things that we are worried about is other people now coming in and saying that they are experts in this field and trying to out people without any ethics around the way that this group tends to operate. And we are getting together. I've initiated something called Forensic Scientometrics, which is an organization and a discipline to try to understand what are our ethics, what do we do, and basically, how do you trust the person bringing this in? So we have for example, we have a person now who is in the US and very public and calls himself, or the USA Today did, a plagiarism hunter. Well, he's not doing that. He's going after people he doesn't like and then seeing whether he can find plagiarism. That is not how those of us in the field work. And so we have to be careful. The other aspect, I would say, on one hand, social media has brought out a lot of these problems, and that's been fantastic. On the other hand, I do think that we have to be careful in the scientific ecosystem about being too public without also owning the narrative that science is complex, that there are honest errors in science, and there's just, it's messy. And that narrative, if we don't control, someone else will, and it will go wild on social media and whatnot.
I'm glad both of you mentioned this, because we do have a slide on intentional errors and unintentional errors. I think we'll discuss a little bit more on that slide. Moving on to the next question, because we are again on retractions. I am not sure whether the retraction process is as efficient as it could be. So my question is to Daniel. In terms of effective strategies for issuing corrections or retractions, is there any scope for improvement here from a publisher point of view?
Well, thank you. There has actually been some development on this. I think you might be aware that NISO, the National Information Standards Organization, issued guidelines called CORREC, which are communications of retractions, removals, and expression of concern earlier this year. And these guidelines are about standardizing these article types on the level of metadata, style, watermarking, and so on, to make them findable by readers, make them consistent, and make them also findable by indexing services. And this is a really good start. And we also have to develop guidelines for retracting at scale, particularly for the paper mill problem, when whole special issues have been compromised. The COPE guidelines that exist are good, and I have reliably followed them for retraction cases myself, but they are written at the scale of the individual article. And many publishers say that that's not appropriate for retractions at scale. Adding to what I've just talked about with NISO and with the COPE guidelines, and that we need more effective guidelines for retractions at scale that also do the right thing, but to authors who might have been caught up in a scam without being nefarious actors themselves. I come back to the point that the drum I'm banging on all the time, which is that collaboration between publishers and other stakeholders is key here. And that we have these discussions inside of the STM Association with COPE and at occasions such as this. So we need to work together to standardize and to move faster on addressing problems. This is one thing that's really useful as a strategy for correcting an error is the publication of an expression of concern. which even if it's work in progress, like issues have been raised, but you're not quite ready to do the retraction yet, you're at least signaling to the community, to the readership, that there's a bit of a warning label on this one, approach with caution. And that way you can keep the community informed and let them know, even if you're not quite ready to do the retraction quite yet.
Yes, because each retraction, I think it does involve a thorough investigation, right? So moving on to the next slide, because I want the audience to know the main types or the causes of retraction. So this is a small study that Springer Nature had done. Of course, the data is only until 2020, so we don't have the latest data. But through this data, we can, basically deduce that the number of retracted papers for duplication, for falsification, and for plagiarism still rank the highest. That is up till 2020. So I think things may have changed after 2020, where paper mills and things like that have come into the picture more prominently. And yeah, IOP, Institute of Physics, it also has retracted or nearly, likely 500 paper mill papers. And this is what they have recently also put out a press release for. So publishers, I think, definitely are taking due notice. The guidelines mentioned by Daniel for NISO, COPE, I think they will help the publishers. They will also help the readers, especially with warning signs. And yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask this next question to Leslie while we are again on the topic of retractions. Unreliable results, right? It is you mentioned science is complex, completely agree. Unreliable results is part of that complexity, right? I wanted to know how this aspect has contributed to the steady rise in retractions. Have you noticed any disparity? And of course, because we're talking about technology here and we're in the era of technology, has AI played a detrimental as well as a constructive role, or both? So yeah, over to you, Leslie.
Yeah, thank you for this question. First of all, and I put this in the chat, one of the things that I worked on when I drafted, and then it's a community thing, is a taxonomy for the retraction, the notices of retractions, withdrawals, expressions of concern, reasons. These were based off of Retraction Watch, but really that put them into 4 quadrants, right? And we're still working on the name, so bear with me on that, but really the kind of flawed research. It's only due to these honest errors. Somebody used an fMRI machine. They didn't know the fMRI machine wasn't consistent. They got results that they thought were significant, published it. It had to do with the machine, not their study, for a biomedical example. And then there's author integrity issues. There's also manipulation. And then there's also systematic problems, as in maybe there's a rogue editor that has been causing problems. So what I have seen from that data, once you put that into a category, is those stay about the same, even while retractions increase, the percentage of those by year stays relatively consistent. Flawed research happens in about 6 to 7% of the retractions that we can say. It doesn't mean that there's not corrections because of flawed research. That happens as well if it doesn't change the outcome of the study. What we're seeing is an actual increase, right, in the number of retractions due to manipulation of either the text or of the results. AI has played a detrimental role, but honestly, it's one piece of the big puzzle. And I will say, if we don't automate checks, we are not going to keep up with the technology, AI or whatever the next thing that we call it, we're not going to.
Yes, because the volume, right? And the volume is
Absolutely.
so high. I mean, the coverage is just not possible if it's just human, and the physical checks are not enough. I think AI still is, obviously we all know it's not perfect, so it has to be compounded by the human assessment. But just for the audience sake, are there any other major contributing factors that you think the audience should know about, apart from the ones that we just discussed?
I just want to iterate that this is not only coming from within the scientific community. There are problems that are coming from within the scientific community, but there's also I'm going to use the tobacco industry because I think that's pretty well known as an organization that's coming in and trying to influence science. The other aspect I really want to talk about is that we have moved to a global research ecosystem and publishing environment. That means that some people, and just thinking of the English literature right now, there are a lot of non-native English speakers, English writers who are publishing their science. And sometimes that communication isn't so clear. And that, in my opinion, those researchers need to be lifted up rather than pushed down by anything that may end up being a retraction because they can't prove that they have their data, that they're not quite at the standards that others would be. That being said, there's some countries that are excelling at that, like Ethiopia. So, you know, I just want to point that out, that we need to be careful with what we're doing.
For sure. Daniel, would you like to add something to this?
I certainly echo Leslie's point about the equity issue. I do want to push back slightly on the idea that AI plays a role, detrimental or constructive, because I want to localize agency where it belongs. I wish we hadn't used the term AI to talk about this, because it implies an intentionality that is not there. This is a tool. This is a language model. But it is interesting. I certainly think that AI, if it can be said to play a role, then it will play the role of poacher as well as gamekeeper in this scenario. I totally agree with Leslie that unless we automate integrity checks, if we just start doing things, if we just continue to do things manually and rely on that, then we are not going to be facing the scale of the problem. I don't think that we should let the computer to make the decision for us. And that's very important, because like when you run something like this, isn't really AI, but when you run something like similarity check and authenticate, and people have asked, well, what kind of percentage, what kind of similarity score is acceptable and not acceptable? It's all about context, that you can't just like let that number make the decision for you.
Yes.
So people have to be involved at the decision stage with all of these things.
Yes.
And I think there's more to come from what we're calling AI, certainly, and the developments that are coming. I think it's very difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen, but so it'll be a wild and bumpy ride, I'm sure.
Yes. So we work very closely actually with Authenticate, and a lot of our products are integrated with those. And when we provide our services to our authors and they want us to check the similarity index, we generally flag it to them, but we don't necessarily alarm them that plagiarism, it's valid plagiarism. We also do a human check, but we just use the number from a flagging point of view, right? If the number is dangerously high, it is definitely a flag. You need to look into what's happening with the paper. If it has a lot of materials and methods, those are the papers we generally find a high similarity index, when compared to other papers. But most of the original reports generally have a very low similarity index. So the tools are definitely good enough to flag, and they're becoming better and better. I mean, we've noticed this over the last 5 years that we have collaborated at Authenticate. We regularly analyze this. So completely agree with you then. Leslie, do you want to add something?
I just wanted to comment that I love those plagiarism checks, because I always check to see if I self-plagiarized. Because, when you're a researcher and you write so much and you can't remember if you said something before or wrote it before. So there's positive ways to use that as well, just to check your own work.
Yes. And with that, let me just quickly tell the audience what are the types of unintentional and intentional misconduct. So that's on the next slide. So like you can see on the slide, there are several reasons misconduct happens. Like there are different backgrounds and different solutions to each one of them. And on the left, the green side, right, they are all errors, genuine errors and unintentional misconduct types. Whereas on the red side, you have intentional misconduct where, of course, paper mills are part of them, image manipulation, buying and selling authorship, data massaging. It's also called as p-hacking or harking. fictitious profiles, and not just by authors, but also by reviewers, editors, and other affiliations, compromise stakeholders from the point of view of conflicts of interest or nonsensical content, basically just, the overall generative AI assisted content development. So these are intentional misconduct, which definitely have a place in valid retractions. I think the middle zone, right, is sort of like an orange zone where peer review manipulation, missing or incomplete competing interests. These are some things that maybe the institutions, the publishers, the stakeholders, and companies like Digital Science, I think they can work together to bring them closer to the green zone, so that the ethics violations are very less. But yeah, like Daniel mentioned, I think the retractions are a good thing for publishers, but I'd rather they be retractions for genuine errors than for intentional misconduct, which actually requires a mindset change, right from the beginning of a researcher's career. So then let's see what we can do there. So moving on to the next question, because now we know the different types of retractions and the intensity at which they occur. This question is for Leslie. So given the shift from minor issues, like we've seen in 2013, for example, in one of the earlier graphs, like redundant publication, for example, it could be a genuine mistake where a publisher just gets back a little too late and the next publisher has already accepted the paper, to major organized threats like paper mills, for which we do have tools. Is the current framework for research ethics or publication ethics sufficient to tackle these diverse challenges? So Leslie, your take?
My take is no. Back to what I said earlier, we have open science at a time where technology has advanced dramatically, and we have not looked at the scaffolds of trust and ensured that those also scale at the rate of technological growth and of open science. So I don't think that the current framework for research ethics are vital. Okay, and I'm not saying anything against any of the groups that run those. They are working hard. They are wearing themselves out. Even getting to a retraction, and Daniel can speak more to this about how much work it takes within a publisher to go through and do your due diligence on retractions is a lot. It is also insufficient for both the quantity of papers and for the organized threats that are going on. There are organized threats coming in and infecting science, both from within. I mean, researchers worked for tobacco companies within, legitimate researchers worked for tobacco companies. There are other major ideological threats, and there's also geopolitical interference when it comes into research. And that one poses a particular challenge because, I'm a researcher, you're a researcher, we've tended to now move globally, and that's been great. But how do we address the fact that the political heirs of our countries are not necessarily aligned, even when we want to align our research? So we have to figure out what are the new ethical challenges that we have and how do we tackle them. Again, I think we talk about this throughout. There is an automated approach that can happen, a computer automated or augmented, but human decision making that needs to happen, and we need to figure out how to do that at scale.
I think there's a related question that I think either of you can answer. And Daniel, I'll let you go first if you need
I
to
would
add
just
something.
like to add a little bit,
Sure.
since Leslie asked me to, about the
Sure.
retraction. I think I mentioned something about this earlier, but it's a scale problem. If you go through the standard code procedures on an individual article level, and I'm on Cope Council, so I'm absolutely not throwing any shade at Cope, but it is a matter of what you can do. If you try to just use those, they don't scale, those approaches. It's also interesting how we're talking about things differently. You would talk about things like a bad actor, or you would talk about things like an unscrupulous researcher. and that has it focuses on the individual. But when you talk about paper mills, it has a sort of industrial overtone. It implies something much more mechanical and something that is almost dehumanized. And I think there's a lot to unpack about how we talk about the problem and the different facets of it. What I do know is that one of the things that's compounded the problem is that we have a lot more sound science journals, and these are really valuable. I am for there being more science being published and everything, but the thing is that these AI generated papers, they're really boring. So it's it's when you're only filtering for correctness and not whether something's interesting or not. I mean, it is they're tedious and not interesting, and therefore it's very important for editors and for peer review operations to be alert to things like tortured phrases, weird language, all the indicators of AI generated research, that because otherwise it's very easy to wade through a paper that basically it doesn't the logical structure of the paper doesn't make sense, but there are plots and there are captions and there's an introduction and a conclusion, so I guess it's okay. So we have to be alert to these kinds of signals of fraudulent research.
For sure. I'll just quickly ask the question that one of the audience members has asked us. So what are the current integrity checks that you see are in most need of automation or are underserved by current tools? Leslie?
The way that I look at trust in research is to first look at the authors and then look at the transparency of the processes that should be in a paper, and then look at the research. I think if we look at the authors first, as in, are they real? You know, I mean, people talk about bringing this up that it's going to be discriminatory. More than anything, it starts filtering out these made-up names and these really unusual publication problems, like trying to boost their H-index type of thing. So then we don't have to spend all of the time looking on whether that's an interesting question, because that is very important and it takes time. So first do that, then look at the transparency. Do they have a funding statement? Do they have ethical approval statement? If they should. These are things that you can check and you can automate. Again, I'm not saying only automate, but you can automate a lot of that, and that would save a lot of time before you get to, is this an interesting question? So I would say that would be a way to approach it.
So it's funny that you mentioned author names. I'm not sure if OrcID is mandatory. Has it been made mandatory by all publishers? No. I'm not sure if that is a very easy solution, that most publishers can undertake. So Daniel, would you have any inputs on this question?
We're strongly encouraging.
Okay.
That right now we're not mandating them. I don't have a crystal ball. I would personally, given my work, I would welcome mandating ORCIDs, ORCIDs. But even with that is not a foolproof system. Anyone can set up an ORCID, and it's there are sometimes more than one ORCID for an individual researcher. So we have to be. We need to use a lot of different trust markers. There are trust markers like raw IDs for affiliations that we're starting to use now at APS, and we're looking at a number of things to ensure that we are dealing with real people who are good faith researchers and authors and reviewers.
All right, thanks for that, Daniel. I wanted to get the audience's pulse also on the topic that we're discussing. So the next slide that you see, audience, is a poll for you. and I would like you to vote for any of the options that you think is the most appropriate. So, what, according to you, is the primary driver for the increase in publication retractions? First option is increased scrutiny by journals. Second, growth of paper mills. Third, improved detection tools. Fourth, higher awareness of ethical misconduct. And fifth, any other reason that you might think of. You can just mention in the comment section. So here's the poll in front of you. The poll will be active for 1 minute, and then we'll close the poll, and we can see the results on our screen once the poll is closed. So I would like the speakers to actually throw a prediction, maybe, to make it more interesting. Leslie, what do you think is going to be the most popular answer?
Oh, but then that might skew the results. My background is in statistics, so now I wanted to vote, but okay. If I have to pick one, though, I would say D, higher awareness of ethical misconduct.
Okay.
Daniel?
Okay. Yes.
Well, I am a physicist, and I know that the action of observing something changes what is being observed. But I can't help noticing that A, B, and D all make us look great, publishers. A, C, and D, rather. But B is actually the one that is out of our control more than a little bit. So I'm going to go with B, growth of paper mills.
Okay, all right. We'll just give the audience 10 more seconds. And yeah, the poll is closed. Can we see the results? Improved detection tools.
My finger is not on the pulse of this audience.
So yes, improved detection tools, which is also, I think, a good sign for publishers. And I think it was closely followed by the option that Leslie selected. So yeah, thanks for that. It was a good interactive poll also. Because we're talking about paper mills, again, I'd like the audience to know what numbers we're talking about right now, because they're totally alarming. The next slide, yes, this one, gives you a good picture of the paper mill problem. And what it tells you is articles with close textual similarity that are produced by these paper mills, which are simply companies producing papers. That's what they call paper mills. It has increased to nearly 2%, the last data that we saw. This is up to, again, 2020, closer to 2021. So 1.8% it's inching towards. But the latest Nature article that I read, it has already surpassed 2%. So knowing the volume of literature and papers that are being submitted to publishers daily, this is high volume. And this is just paper mills that we're talking about. So moving on to the next slide, which is a specific question about paper mills. Can the panelists quickly share insights on the specific challenges that predatory journals and paper mills pose to reputable publishing? We understand there are some basic concepts that we from the STM industry might know, but I just want the audience to know right from scratch, what are these specific challenges? Say, if we have more and more paper mills and predatory journals, what is the threat to science? And also, could you share some actionable measures to combat predatory publishing practices? So, Daniel, I think I'll let you go first.
I mean, these articles pollute the scientific corpus and waste time and resources. That they waste. It is a drag on the scientific system. It is, as you mentioned, there's a non-negligible effort to remove these articles. The predatory journals don't do any retractions. Paper mills aren't journals, obviously. The paper mills can also, it isn't just about it being nonsense necessarily. It can also be stuff that's really nefarious and that can be used to sow doubt when there shouldn't be doubt about stuff that's become established, a science established knowledge, and then all of a sudden you have but CO2 is actually good for us to have in the atmosphere. It's plant food. It is doesn't there's no, that whole greenhouse gas thing is completely misled. I mean, you can read all sorts of stuff that can back up whatever opinion you might want to have. There are measures, there collaboration again, which is the drum I keep banging, that one can do about the predatory publishing practices. I note that Clarivate, like Web of Science, is taking strides to delist journals that engage in predatory practices, that have suspicious procedures, or that seems vulnerable to paper mill. I don't love the impact factor, but we have seen that journals that lose their impact factor go off a cliff. They don't become attractive venues later for authors. And basically saying that you have to adhere to certain standards of validation or you cannot be considered a reputable journal, I think that's totally fair game.
Totally. Leslie, what's your take on this?
I would agree that it dilutes the trust in research as a whole. I think that, and I really like the pollution analogy, but here's the thing, is if you see debris floating in a river, in the ocean, you know that it's pollution. What you don't see and you can't see are the small chemicals that are in the water that are also polluting it, right? And that's what's really scary about this, is that you have this false sense of security, you being the public, you being other researchers, you being new researchers, have this false sense of security that what you're diving into is clean and pure and not going to harm anything. And I think that's a challenge not only to predatory journals, because there are reputable publishers who have very problematic issues at certain journals. The other thing that I just want to bring in again is the equity aspect, because sometimes it is difficult to see the difference between a predatory journal and a very new journal in a space that doesn't have experience with journals. And so any markers we do, any trust markers that we make on these, any lists that we make, there has to be a way for people who are starting something new to also get off those lists or to do better or to commit to things, so that we can have this growth of a global scientific society and with some of the complexities and understanding that people are at different stages of growth.
Absolutely. I think we can go on to the next slide, but we should probably skip this question, because here mainly we were going to talk about limitations in traditional methods, but I think we've already covered that scale, basically only human interventions is not enough and technology needs to help, etc. So I think we can skip this slide and move on to the next one, where I just quickly want to tell the audience what is AI's potential here in detecting ethical issues. So a study from BMJ, it actually evaluated 4 LLMs, large language models, to determine their effectiveness. And the results indicated that while the LLMs, they did perform suboptimally in some areas, their accuracy improved significantly with multiple prompts by humans. So it just goes to say that integrity teams and every stakeholder that participates in upholding integrity, if they just work along with AI to catch these errors, intentional errors, and streamline these issues, I think more or less AI can outperform manual methods definitely in efficiency, but also with consistency and without errors, because it would be properly utilized. So especially, say, for example, detecting duplicate submissions or faster decision making by assisting preliminary manuscript screening, which also could be extended to ESLs for English as a second language speakers. So these some of the things that AI definitely has potential in helping publishers as well as institutions right from scratch, so that it doesn't really go to the retraction stage where as we've discussed, resources are wasted. So moving to the next question, I'll skip the first question here, but definitely the second question I want both the panelists to answer. Are there any types of misconduct that still remain challenging to detect, even with advanced tools? Daniel.
Yes.
Do you have...
And I will elaborate on that brief answer. We don't have, I think that AI tools are still not able to identify whether or not, sorry, I looked at this before. Some authorship issues that are still beyond AI tools as I understand them. to evaluate. It's hard to evaluate, for instance, guest, ghost, gift authorship. There can be some indications if somebody, well, because one can look at affiliations and geographical distributions and things like that, but it's certainly still an open problem. I like what I see about citation analysis to identify citation cartels and citation networks, but it is also there are still signals that are eluding us about whether or not a paper ought to have been cited. I think that the main thing I would say that is still very difficult for AI to do is conceptual plagiarism, when it is not about copying words, and it's not, but rather it's a idea about ideas and approaches that are being plagiarized. And I see this as more of a problem, not perhaps so much in the sciences, but in the social sciences and in the humanities, where there's a different, the way that the knowledge that you bring across is differently phrased. I think AI also has a long way to go to deal with behavioral misconduct, harassment, bullying, things like that that's beyond the individual article, that's underlying, and I still think that is a mountain to climb to get to that.
All right. Okay. I think Leslie will find the next question more interesting, so I'll give that to her. On the flip side, Leslie, what are the other technical innovations that you think are most promising to promote research integrity?
So everybody should know I started a company called Repeta that was acquired by Digital Science. I work for Digital Science now, so I'm just saying that, but I had developed algorithms with my team to find trust markers, how we identify trust markers within papers. And I think the answer to this question is two parts. And by the way, I had a definition of trust markers, and so did OrcID, and then we've come together and we're trying to align those so we don't have multiple definitions of trust markers floating around, and it's going quite well. I think there's two parts to this. One is showing what is good through technology, as in being able to find who are doing really well at being transparent about putting data availability statements on their papers. Ethiopia, Uganda, a lot of sub-Saharan African countries are the top ones. And before anyone asks, well, how many papers do they publish? Ethiopia is about 18,000 per year. So this is not an insignificant number. And technology can pull that out and pull out the good things that are going on in science. I also, to Daniel's part about finding authorship, I personally am excited about the way that we're using network analysis in order to understand what good networks look like among legitimate researchers, and that's only possible with technology. And so I think those are some things that we can do to help both promote the good conversations of research integrity, as well as looking at the dodgy stuff that goes on and getting rid of that.
Super. I think we almost running out of time, but we can fit in a couple of slides maybe. But I do want the audience to take up the next poll. And in the meanwhile, maybe we can discuss the question that an attendee has asked. So quickly, audience, this is your poll now. From an institution point of view, because we've spoken about, from a publisher's perspective, how should institutions prioritize training on research integrity according to you? Should there be mandatory workshops for all students and researchers? Should it be integrated into your graduate curriculum? Should there be online training modules that people can refer to from time to time? Periodic awareness campaigns? Or do you think training is simply not mandatory? So audience, please feel free to poll. And in the interest of time, I'd like to answer this question that the attendee has asked us, an anonymous attendee has asked us. They ask, how important is it to train the upcoming generation of researchers with respect to prompt engineering in order to make their research writing smarter? Leslie, can we go with you first?
That's where change happens, right? It's not, and I just want to say, it's not just the new researchers, right? Mm-hmm. It's also the at institutions. It's those that support the researchers that need to be the new generation that need to be trained. And prompt engineering, first of all, I think we all need training in that, not just new people, because I'm amazed at the differences of it, which kind of goes to the periodic awareness campaigns answer that you have in here, is that we need that based on new developments that happen.
For sure. Daniel, would you like to add something to this? Oh, we have the poll results also, but I'll let Daniel go first.
I think that training is key, and I very much agree with what Leslie just said. And I do think that the idea that it is only starting off early career researchers, PhD students, and such that need to be told about research integrity is a mistake. I think people need a refresher, and I think that this is something which we need to continue to talk about, especially since we've highlighted throughout this workshop that the landscape has changed about research integrity and about publication ethics. So for that reason, everybody should refresh themselves on the developments in this area.
For sure. And I think the audience actually believes that integration into graduate curriculum, before the post-graduation and the PhD work all starts, that is the most effective way, followed by mandatory workshops for all students and researchers, which I think we all can agree with. So that's I think a good sign. Moving on to the next slide. Because we are talking about the role of institutions, we had actually conducted a survey from an Inago Academy point of view. And these are, in short, the survey results. Primarily, we wanted to know the training measures, at university and organization level, because we work with a lot of them. And what they mentioned was actually 45% of them, nearly, actually get regular guidance from their seniors, from their principal investigators and the research offices, which is a good sign. But nearly same number, which is 33%, also say that the training measures are non-comprehensive, so they don't really cover all aspects. I think a small majority also says that they had to refer to different guidelines themselves. So I think it's all about getting the guidelines out there as much as possible. And on the right side, the graph actually indicates institutional support to report ethical breaches. So 56% actually have reported that they haven't experienced or witnessed any whistleblowing at their university or institution, which may indicate that the environment is not supportive enough, or that there just haven't been that many cases. But also 31% do say that the institution does provide support, but the level of protection could be improved, and it could be made more secure for whistleblowers to actually come out and talk about these unethical practices. So this was just for everyone to know. I think we're in our last minute. I think we've already overshot. So basically, let's move to the last slide of the presentation. And not the disclaimer, yes. So as we look toward the future for ethical research and publishing, I just want the panelists to tell us what is that one transformative change or initiative that you believe would have the most significant impact on fostering the culture of integrity across academia and industry. Daniel, I think you can go first.
So I think my answer is not going to be a single transformative change, but rather more of what's already starting to happen, which is cross-publisher collaboration with all of the, well, not just with publishers. As I said earlier, I'm on COPE Council, and COPE has started to admit institutions as members as well in COPE. We need to work with all the stakeholders that have an interest in maintaining and upholding research integrity, and it's important to have a wide variety of perspectives and many people at the table. We need to all be pulling in the same direction, basically, and this is the hard work that has to be done.
Definitely. Leslie, would you like to add?
I'm just going to say, in addition to what Daniel says about working together, is we need to have a cohesive message about trust in science and trust in research. That it is complex, but we believe in what we are doing, and that we will uphold both the research integrity of the researchers who are heavily burdened at this point, with the support of the institutions, with the support of the publishers, with the support of the funders, so that we can move our ecosystem forward in a trusted manner.
For sure. I think that brings us to the end of this workshop. Thank you so much, Daniel and Leslie, and thank you to the audience who stuck through even though we overshot by 5 minutes. Again, thank you to the panelists, and I hope everyone enjoyed the session and also have some takeaways. Thank you, and we'll see you again in the next webinar. Bye,
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.